Good evening, and thank you for attending our virtual panel discussion on Thornton Wilder and his play, Our Town. My name is Elisabeth Angele. I am responsible for information and patron services at the Hamden Public Library. Thornton Wilder was born on April 17, 1897 in Wisconsin, in Madison, Wisconsin, and died on December 7, 1975 in Hamden. He is the only writer ever to be honored with Pulitzer Prizes in both fiction and drama. His most famous play, Our Town, for which he won a Pulitzer Prize in 1938, continues to awe audiences. This panel discussion is offered in conjunction with the 20th anniversary production of Our Town by the Whitney Players. Performances will run from January 18 to January 20th at the Hamden Hall Country Day School. For ticket information, please go to thewhitneyplayers.org. I would like to especially thank Christine Witten and Jackie Downing from the Whitney Players for helping to bring this panel discussion about. Before I introduce you to our panelists and moderator this evening, I would like to do some Zoom keeping. To achieve the best sound quality, everyone will be muted. When you want to participate in the discussion, please unmute yourself. Please check the library website, hamdenlibrary.org, for other library programs we are offering. Please note that we will record this program to the Zoom cloud and then upload it to the library's YouTube channel. It is now my great pleasure to introduce our presenters this evening. Our moderator is Ray Andrewsen. Mr. Andrewsen has enjoyed a lengthy career in radio broadcasting. He was the general manager and morning show host of the award-winning Quinnipiac University's WQUN for over 22 years. He became the executive director of the Quinnipiac Chamber of Commerce in 2021. Welcome, Mr. Andrewsen.
To be here.
Thank you. I would also like to introduce our two panelists. Jackson Bryer is Professor Emeritus of English at the University of Maryland, where he taught undergraduate and graduate courses for 41 years. He has edited or co-edited more than 25 books on American playwrights. He is a member of Penn Faulkner Board since 1991 and serves as the president of the Thornton Wilder Society. He is the co-editor of Conversations with Thornton Wilder, published in 1992, and the Selected Letters of Thornton Wilder, published in 2008. Welcome, Professor Bryer.
Thank you.
Our second panelist is Thomas Hischak, who was Professor of Theatre at the State University of New York at Cortland from 1983 to 2015. He is an internationally recognized author and teacher in the performing arts. He has written over 30 nonfiction books about theater, film, and popular music. He recently published the Thornton Wilder Encyclopedia. He also writes award-winning plays and is currently an adjunct professor teaching film and theater at Flagler College in St. Augustine, Florida. Thank you all for participating in our Thornton Wilder panel discussion. And I now hand over the microphone to our moderator, Ray Andrewsen. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Hello, everyone. Great to be with you to discuss a local icon. one of our greatest playwrights, one of the greatest, if not the greatest American play, Our Town. And it's great to be here with Dr. Bryer, Professor Hischak as well. Thornton Wilder, as you know, is buried in Hamden, lived in Hamden on Deepwood Drive, has deep roots in this area, but was on the road a lot, beyond Yale and around the world as he traveled. So we're going to hear from our two panelists tonight. We're going to have a conversation of about a half hour, 35, 40 minutes. Then we're going to welcome you to come in about 40, 45 minutes into the program with any questions that you may have. As you just heard from Elizabeth, we would like you to raise your hand and unmute your microphone when it's time so we can take your questions for our panelists here tonight in order. So let's begin. And in our town of Hamden and beyond. So I have to ask you both, Professors Bryer and Hischak, because you've studied Thornton Wilder. In our town, we're going back to 1920s, 1930s. But if I can start with you, Dr. Bryer, why is Thornton Wilder relevant today? Why is he relevant today?
Well, all I can start by saying to you, Ray and Tom, is that this morning I read the play for perhaps the 20th or 25th time, and it moved me probably just as much as the first time I read it. So that's a pretty good test of any play, particularly one that was written in 1938. I think that one of the reasons the play lasts is exactly why Wilder wrote it in the first place. He once said that the central theme of the play, it is what is the relation between the countless unimportant details of our daily life on the one hand and the great perspective of time, social history, and current religious ideas on the other. So what you have in this play are very recognizable daily events, getting up in the morning, going to school, young people, parents and children, young love, marriage, parents talking to one another, talking to their children, the activities of a small town doctor and a small town newspaper editor. And at the same time, it seems to me, you have things that go well beyond the particular, things that are universal about how we deal with our daily lives and how as the play ultimately comes to an end, how we failed perhaps to appreciate our daily lives as much as we should. And so somebody once said that all good, they were talking about novels, but you could say it about plays just as much. All good plays are not what they're about. And I think Our Town is the essence of a play that is not what it's about. And yet it is about what it's about. It's about a small town, probably someplace in New England, but it's about a great, great deal more than that. And that's what keeps it alive.
Professor Hischak, 1938, and here we are in 2024. Is there a linear line that we can go back to that time and bring in relevance to today?
The year 1938, when the play opens, is not the issue. The play takes place at the turn of the century. And that audience in 1938, it was as foreign to them as it is to us today. Unless you were pretty old in the audience, you did not remember 1904 vividly, or if you did, you were a child. So when we look at the play, we say, oh, how quaint. Oh, look how they used to do things. We're not looking at 1938. We're looking at Wilder's vision of a small town at the turn of the century. And I think that's important because even when it opened, it was removed from time. It wasn't a contemporary set play. It was about a time that was a little nostalgic for the audience, and for us, foreign maybe, especially young audiences. This is a whole different era. But I think that's what the play is about. It's not about today, it's about all time. And if it's significant of what happened to these people in 1904, for one of the acts is 1904, if that's significant to an audience in 1938, it's just as significant today. And that's been proven by the effect the play has. Young people, they don't teach this play in schools anymore. I don't know what plays they teach, if any, but when they see this play, not read it, but when they see it, they are moved. I've seen student performances of this play, you know, with 300-400 high school students, and they are moved by it. Something so foreign as, you know, a town where, you know, they talk about the first automobile is going to come along in a few years. I mean, this is so foreign to them, and yet by the end of that play, they are so caught up in it, and I don't think anything has changed. That's where the power, I think, is, that remove you from the time period to make the point that it's not important, the time period. Everything that happens still happens and is still true.
So the greatness of the play is its enduring quality from 1904 to 1938 to today in contemporary life. But we're living with artificial intelligence, selfies, social media. We've gone back to television. But in 1938, when the play was out, we were in a cultural crisis pre-World War II, had just gone through the Great Depression and continuing in the late 30s. So there was social upheaval, segregation, Jim Crow, a lot of Americans did not enjoy rights at that era. And in 1904, a different era. So the enduring messages are not so much about the technology, it's about the social condition. So Professor Hischak, maybe you can talk about that. The evolution of social condition, but this play still fits into all these changes.
I think that's because Wilder was so good at taking the mundane, everyday things and making them important. You know, so he's not talking about the latest inventions. This little town is behind the times. It's not what's new that's affecting everybody. It's what's old. A mother talking to a daughter and telling her, in one of my most favorite lines, "You're pretty enough for all normal purposes." Now, how many mothers could, you know, it would still that would say to their daughter, you know, "My pretty mom," you know, is like, "You're pretty enough for normal purposes." That's not about 1904. That's about all time. And the relationship between the young people and the soda fountain. Yeah, they're a little more naive than kids are today, but not really. You know, that shyness, that wanting to be liked, that wanting to be accepted, none of that has changed. There are so many little details in the play that I think still come up in our lives. And I don't think any social media, it's changed that. It's interpersonal, it's person to person, it's not on the phone. There are no phones at this time. It's not texting, it's not, you know, but that one-to-one thing. And maybe today, because people don't talk to each other as much, it's all the more significant. There is something about these people just talk to each other. They don't always say what they mean. They don't always express themselves, you know, clearly, but they're talking to each other. And I think that's part of the nostalgia of this play is, oh, remember back when you had to sit your son down and talk to him about chopping wood for his mother because you love her and you don't want her to chop wood. Well, that's so foreign to us, but at the same time, that basic instinct is still there.
So Jackson Bryer, you read it 25 times now. So 25 times. Imagine if you had to read IKEA furniture assembly instructions 25 straight times, right? I mean, this obviously was compelling for you to read it. So what did you take every time that you read this play, you must have a different insight or a different take.
Well, Ray mentions his favorite line. One of my favorite lines is when I forget whether it's the Webbs or the Gibbses are talking about when they first met. And he says to her, I was afraid we wouldn't have material for conversation more than last a few weeks. Anybody
Right.
who's ever been in a relationship, male, female, homosexual, whatever, can identify with a remark like that. As Ray says, that doesn't have anything to do with 1901, 1904, 1938, or 2024. It has to do with all time. And I think, Ray, I think the other thing that happens, and it happens with all great literature, I think, you notice different things each time you encounter the play. That's particularly true when it's performed. For example, it's become fashionable, and I notice this is true of the Hamden production that opens this week. It's become fashionable to cast a woman as a stage manager. That would never have occurred, I think, in 1938. It probably wouldn't have occurred for 20 years after that. But in fact, as Ray can certainly testify, and Tom too, most of the actual stage managers in theater these days are.
They are.
So the idea of putting a woman in that role, as they'll be doing in Hamden, is perfectly appropriate. And yet it changes the play a little bit. It doesn't, as I think Tom would agree, it doesn't make radical change, because anything the male stage manager says, a female stage manager could say just as well. I think the whole orientation towards Simon Stimson in the play has changed over the years. It's never made clear what Simon Stimson's problem is, but increasingly in recent years, people have speculated that maybe he was gay. He certainly is an alcoholic, but that may be the secondary symptom of something far deeper. And matter of fact, that's implied, that his alcoholism is merely a manifestation of something beyond that. And certainly our attitudes towards alcohol, towards gay people, have changed over the 30 some odd, 50 some odd, 60 some odd years we're talking about. So you see the play differently now when you read about Simon Stimson. One of my students once said about Simon Stimson something I'd never thought of until they brought it up, and that is, most of the time when you hear about Simon Stimson, you hear about him rather than from him, and you never really get to hear his side of the story. And this student was outraged. She felt the town never gave Simon Stimson any forum to talk. That was something I'd never noticed before. So I think each time you read this play, I'm sure Tom can come up with similar moments that he hadn't realized one time. And of course, every time you see it, when you see it with live actors, all of whom bring their own particular personalities as well as Wilder's lines to the play, you can often see different facets of it. But as Tom said, the enduring moments of the play, I mean, it's impossible to read the soda fountain scene without tearing up. Even if you're not sentimental, it's impossible not to read, because Wilder understood how to depict that first flush of young love and of a bashful couple coming to terms with their feelings about one another. It's just a marvelous scene.
So some of the characters are very accessible. And Tom, I would imagine for you too, as Jackson just mentioned, there are some mysteries, some characters we analyze, or maybe we're today in a contemporary sense having maybe this was the issue. So there's still some mystery embedded in some of the characters.
Simon is obviously an outsider. He's not accepted. The stage manager says, after he's dead, I believe, says that some people just really don't belong in a small town. He really didn't belong there, whatever it was, his sexual orientation. He loved great music, and this was a small town that did not appreciate great music. They just, wanted hymns. I'll tell you, a revealing thing to me was one production. I've seen so many. An African American played the stage manager, and he played him as an African American. He didn't, just ignore the fact. And he's an outsider. He's looking at it, and I'm thinking, boy, what is this guy doing in this town? And his view of everybody is a little different because he is not one of them. And there's one line that I'm sure everybody misses that became so important. He's talking about the town, and he says, oh, the so-and-so's here, and the drugstore's over there, and the Presbyterian church. Oh, and the Baptist church is down in the holler. It's not even in the town, the Baptist church. Who's going to the Baptist church in New Hampshire? Maybe some African Americans, maybe some people from the South, maybe some other outsiders. And it was just so interesting. He said that, and he kind of smiled like, yeah, that's where we are. We're in the holler. That's where we, fit into this town. It was such a revealing moment in a play that I knew by heart. And that line, which just kind of goes by, all of a sudden was like, wow, the stage manager is a person, and a very real person. And it was revealing. Yeah. So the play is, things like that could happen. You have one actress who plays Mrs. Webb, just so slightly different. And you can see this is a very unhappy, frustrated woman who just puts up with life because that's what life is. And you say, wow, I never noticed that before. Of one of the great lines, just once in your life, I think you ought to go to a place where they don't speak English and they don't want to. She'd like to see that Paris, Paris, France is. And but depending on how the actress plays it, that woman she's breathing. She's not just a mother or a wife.
And the other thing, Ray, is that there's a lot of unhappy things that happen in this play. I mean, it's often derided. I think I said this to you when you spoke to me earlier about the play before the session, that it's, sometimes criticized for a kind of Norman Rockwell view of America. It's anything but that. I mean, think of all that happens in this play. Tom just mentioned Julia Gibbs, who in Act One talks about going to Paris, France with the $350 that she can sell her ancestors' piece of furniture for. And then in Act Three, you find out she never got to go to Paris, France, because Emily says in the cemetery scene that she and George used the $350 that they inherited from Julia Gibbs, who has died, to buy something for their farm. And you're supposed to realize that Julia Gibbs never gets to France. And think of all the characters who died. Julia Gibbs dies. One of the children dies. Newsboy gets killed in the war. I think one of the things Tom mentioned right at the beginning that I think is very interesting, and I must admit I hadn't thought to bring this up before. It's interesting why Wilder chose to set a play written in 1938 in 1901 to 1913, because there are lots of things about this town that make it very provincial and very much of the 1901 time. For example, you remember when the professor and the stage manager are talking about the town, and I forget whether, I guess it's the stage manager who says, women vote indirect in the town. Makes you aware that this was a time before women had the right to vote. And there is also a great deal, and again, I think this becomes very much more apparent when you think of it in terms of 2024, and Tom sort of implied this when he was talking about the way the town was laid out. There's a great deal of reference to Polish Town and the fact that in Polish Town people lock their doors, whereas the Gibbses and the Webbs don't have to lock their doors.
Mhm.
There's definitely a split in this town between the people who have money and the people who don't.
Mhm.
And there's that wonderful moment when the stage manager is presenting information about the town, when the so-called belligerent man gets up and says, does anybody in this town have any social, how does he put it? Anyone in town aware of social injustice and individual inequality? And the stage manager says, oh, yes, everybody is something terrible. Seems like they spend most of their time talking about who's rich and who's poor. And the belligerent man says, then why don't they do something about it? Whereupon the stage, and then the belligerent man leaves.
Mhm.
And the stage manager never has a chance to respond to it, because clearly he doesn't have a response to it, because the town is very, very segregated in that way. So there are a lot of little things about this place that make it less than, that make it real. I mean, one of my other favorite lines is, and it seems to me it sums up the play. Somebody says at the end of the play, I think one of the dead people, my, wasn't life awful, and wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
And life is awful and wonderful, and that's what the play is about.
Mm-hmm. I want to add to what you said. This is not a rose-colored vision of a small American town like in a Norman Rockwell picture. Death is all over the place, and people accept it. People die. Wally died because he was on a camping trip and he had his appendix burst. That's a fact. And she says, you remember, Mom, we felt just terrible about it. And then life goes on. At one point, one of the dead people asked another one, why is Emily there? She died in childbirth. And I think that's where they say, wasn't life wonderful, awful? These are just facts of life: death, unhappiness, discontent. And the play, besides not being a optimistic view of the world, it's actually very, very dark by the end, to say the great tragedy of man is not the terrible things that happens to him or her. It's the inability to appreciate life while you're living it. That is the tragedy. And I don't think there's any other play that it ever has addressed that. And I know hundreds and hundreds of plays, and maybe some novels, that I don't know. But the idea that our inability, not that we're too stupid, or we cannot comprehend how precious life is while we're living it.
Yeah.
Only in retrospect, and it takes dead people in a cemetery to see that.
Well, I have to ask you both. If you had an invitation to go up Deepwood Drive in Hampton to Thornton Wilder's house, he's invited you to lunch.
Uh-huh.
All right. And the three of you are at the table and you're having your lunch. What would you both like to ask him? A sip of water first for you, Tom.
I am amazed by his dialogue. And so I would ask him, how can you make such everyday conversation so funny? These people talk to each other and it's funny, but it's not a comedy and they're not making jokes. It's the recognition. I said, how do you do that? Because he did not grow up he grew up in a family situation. He was very close to a lot of his family members and everything. I guess to get to your question is, did people talk like that when you grew up, or did you invent that? Because that dialogue, those lines that are so funny only because they're not trying to be, And yeah, that's what I'd ask him.
Yeah, I guess I feel a little bit the same way. I mean, I guess I'd ask him what I always asked writers that I admire. How do you know so much? I mean, all great writing is recognition. I mean, on the part of the reader, on the part of the writer. And it seems to me what we're talking about with our town is how much we recognize in it. Whether it's 2024, 1938, or 1904, we recognize, we identify, we are moved, as Tom and I both have admitted, that we're moved by passages in this play. I once wrote to Edward Albee about this play, asking him whether, because I knew he admired Wilder, and asked him if he would talk about the play. And he said, there are just two plays that I know where I tear up at a particular line. I think one was a Beckett play, not surprisingly, in Albee's case. And the other one, interestingly enough, is the moment in our town when Emily goes back to see her 12th birthday, and her father says twice, actually, "Where's my girl? Where's my birthday girl?" And Albee said he never can read that line without tearing up. And yeah, I would ask Wilder how you come up with things like that. Where do they come from? You know, it's a variety of what Tom was saying. Are these things that actually happened to you? I suspect not. I suspect they came out of his imagination. But I would love to hear what the process was. I mean, he claims in a couple of letters he wrote that he derived the third act from Dante, and the idea of the dead being on stage and things like that. And he was an extraordinarily well-read human being. I mean, he knew world literature better than almost any playwright that I know of. And so some of it came out of his reading and his knowledge, but that's not what I'm interested in. I'm interested in what came out of his understanding, his recognition, his feelings.
Yeah.
So we're dealing with an era of loneliness. I think a lot of people are described as lonely, or feeling they don't have a sense of belonging, or they're not part of a larger group. And this is, of course, all the complexities of a town written into this beautiful play. So let's address the loneliness angle if we can, and the isolation, the lack of belonging. Is that really the major theme, do you find, Jackson and Tom, in our town?
Well, it's both, isn't it, Tom? I mean, it's both the isolation. I mean, certainly Simon Stimson is an isolated, ostracized figure, and the fact that Wilder sought to include him, and even though he's not, you know, he doesn't appear that much in the play, he's definitely there for a reason, and he's there for the social ostracization that can happen in a small town. But, you know, I think Tom was very good in talking. I mean, you know, these are two good marriages, the Gibbses and the Webbs, but there, you know, there are tensions. You know, Julia Gibbs wants to go to Paris, and her husband wants to go to the Civil War battlefield.
That's right. The battlefields, yeah.
You know, and so she feels alone in some ways, and yet you can imagine when she dies that Doc Gibbs is, you know, probably cries for weeks after it happens. So there is a lot of isolation. We haven't even mentioned Mrs. Soames, the woman who is always talking at the wedding about how beautiful the wedding is. And, you know, there's that wonderful moment. And again, this is so real at the wedding. Well, even before the wedding, I forget whether it's Doc Gibbs or Mr. Webb, or which of the married couple says, "When I first saw you, I didn't even know who you were at my wedding. I didn't recognize you." And then, of course, at George and Emily's wedding, Emily doesn't even want to go on. She wants the wedding not to take place, and George wants to go home and be with his baseball buddies. So everybody feels alone, everybody feels lonely, but also there is a tremendous sense of community in this town. And it's, I mean, what's wonderful about this play is it resists easy categorization, easy generalizations. When you say this is a happily married couple, get the Gibbses and the Webbs, yes, but.
Mm-hmm.
When you say George and Emily are happily married, yes, but.
Mm-hmm.
There's that wonderful moment in the first act when one of the young men in town, or I guess it's either the newsboy or the milkman, says that the teacher in town is getting married, moving out of town. And he says, I think she ought to stay in town. If you're a teacher, you ought to stay a teacher.
Right.
And, there's this real sense of either or right. Yes, but. What do you think, Tom?
He says that, we don't know too much about this kid, and yet he's disturbed by change. He doesn't like the change. I think she should just be a teacher. That's what she is, Mrs. Soames, depending on how it's played, she's a desperately lonely woman. Yeah. She has no one. She doesn't talk about her kids. She doesn't talk about her husband. She has, she's probably a widow. She's Mrs. Soames, I believe. And she's so thrilled at the wedding because she probably has nothing else in her life, and if you play it that way, sometimes she's just played as a comic, kind of a flibberty-gibbet kind of thing. But here's a woman who lives through watching other people get married and that sort of thing. I think those minor characters are so interesting. They're just given a little bit, and then you can go from it. Poor Wally. Wally has one line in the play, and all he says is, "Oh ma," at breakfast. I got to know all about Canada by 10 o'clock. He's looking at his textbook. There's going to be a test about Canada. That's his only line, and that just says like, this is this kid. It's like, yeah, that's his life. That's everything you need to know about him at that point, Wilder could do that. I think it's because he wrote so many short plays, one acts that are not even one act, they're very short, 10 minutes. And he learned how, in 10 minutes, how far you can go and create a character. And in this play, he's got a lot of characters who are three-dimensional, but they're not major characters, they're just there. Some of those people, the dead people in the cemetery, just a few things that they say. It's like, wow, I know you.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious about if you were to take and extrapolate the feelings of someone studying for Canada, about Canada in 1901 or 1904, what they'd be studying now, because that's changed. The technology has changed. So the references with radio, television, and mass communications today. So if you were to rewrite the play, Heresy, but if you were to rewrite this play, what themes do you think you would blend? What ingredients would you blend into the omelet here? And Tom, why don't you take it first?
Well, like Wally would be sitting at the breakfast table with his laptop, and he would say, I have to do a PowerPoint on Canada by 10 o'clock. It would be the same thing, eat your breakfast. No, I got to get this thing done. What changes, I don't know. Yeah, to rewrite it, I think you can add all the modern technology, but if you didn't, as long as you kept the relationships, it would be the same.
Not the same. Yeah.
I think that's, so maybe, I don't know, George and Emily text each other back and forth instead of having an ice cream soda.
I think that's
not the same, but
I think that's an interesting question, Ray, because I think that's the very reason that he said it in 1901. Because it was remote and it was different. I mean, if you can imagine how it sounded to an audience in 1938 to think that women couldn't vote, to think that there were no cars, because he wanted to denaturalize it.
Mhm.
He wanted it not to be about the time in the greatest mistake anybody could make, and by God, somebody is going to do this at some point, is put cell phones in the hands of these characters in a production and bring it up to date, because its very remoteness in terms of the time in which it was written is very deliberate on Wilder's part to make you see the very thing we've been talking about, how remoteness in time doesn't affect feelings, emotions, universal things that we all have experienced. I mean, he could have said it in 1920. He could have said it in 1930. He could have said it any time. He could have said it in 1938. But he chose to set it in 1901 deliberately to defamiliarize his audience with what was going on. And so, I mean, I know you weren't serious when you asked what we would do to it, but it would be the worst. And believe me, Tom could probably testify to this. I've seen some really bad modernizations of modern plays when directors think they can improve upon them. This is a play that you do that at your absolute peril. I mean, I can't imagine. I mean, as Tom says, you can have diversity in your cast, and it doesn't make the slightest bit of difference. And it, as Tom said, it might add a little bit in some ways, but you don't want to modernize this play, because that is what it's that's fatal to it.
There have been productions I've seen where they wanted to add scenery, they wanted to have stove, and and all the things, and it added nothing. Even though there were period, it didn't add anything, because the point was we don't need to see all that stuff. Costumes is always questionable. All right, if this is a empty theater, I mean an empty stage in a theater, would they be dressed in the period? Would they be dressed in 1938 rehearsal clothes? Off-Broadway production not that long ago, they were in rehearsal in 2015, let's say, I forgot what year it was, and they were dressed 2015, but they were doing this play in that period. They didn't change that. So you can do certain things, but Wilder, the play is so ahead of its time that it's silly for us to think we can update it.
I mean, that's the other thing about it, is that as much as it is a period piece, it's also theatrically very avant-garde. I mean, before 1938, the notion of having a stage manager type figure on the stage was unheard of, as far as I know. And now, of course, you walk into a theater all the time and a character comes forward and speaks directly to the audience. The idea of no scenery, 1938, was heresy. I love this, a line that Wilder wrote in one of his essays. He said, "The scorn of verisimilitude throws all the greater emphasis on the ideas which the play hopes to offer." The idea is, if you throw away the scenery, people will pay attention to the ideas rather than be.
But just imagine the shock. Every theater in New York, and let's face it, he's writing this. He knows these are New Yorkers. They live in a big city. I think it's another reason why he put it in a small town. He wanted to remove it from most of the people in the audience are going to be urban, contemporary. But every time you went into a theater, there was a curtain. You always saw a curtain, and you walked into this theater and there is no curtain. There's no scenery, and you can see the pipes and not only the pipes, but the heating, what do you call it, radiators, and a brick wall, and they're almost like, this is going to be strange. This is going to be odd. This is avant-garde theater, as he put it, and some of that was going on already, but just that was so far ahead of its time. We're used to, now we walk into the theater, we don't expect to see a curtain. I haven't seen a curtain in years. We see what the director wants you to see when you walk in. There's no mystery. What's going to happen behind the curtain? That is way ahead of its time. There's no question. Talking to the audience, no question. Very radical.
Yeah. So we're at that point where we can welcome some of your questions for Professors Bryer and Hischak. If you'd like, raise your hand, unmute yourself. Or an informal group here with our discussion here tonight. I actually have another question here, and that's related to just the aspect of Main Street and this whole small town idea. And you mentioned New York City, so urban theater goers would have a different notion. We still have this rural-urban divide now. Did Thornton Wilder tried to speak to that in an earlier era where there was declining rural communities. Farmers were beginning to struggle at that point in time. Cities and urbanization of America by the 20s and 30s had become reality. So was he trying to connect the dot between rural and urban America?
Well, I think what Tom said makes a lot of sense. He was very aware he was writing always in theater for a Broadway audience. And again, I think he wanted to defamiliarize. He wanted to put it. I mean, one of the many interesting things about our town is that in many ways it is extremely exotic at the same time as is extremely ordinary. And one of the ways it was extremely exotic was to take a New York audience and transport them to a small town in New England, which they wouldn't have known anything about. And I think that was very deliberate, as I said earlier, on his part. I think he was aware that there was a complete divide in the country, as it certainly is today. I mean, you watched the Iowa caucuses last night, and that's a world that those of us on the East Coast who've grown up in big cities have, no idea. I live in a town where if there's an inch of snow, everybody stays home for days. Well, in Iowa, they had 2 feet of snow, and everybody thought nothing of going out to the caucuses. So you're aware of that now just as much. And I think Wilder was aware of that. He spent some time in Peterborough, New Hampshire while he was writing this play and before he wrote this play. And I think and of course he lived in Hamden, which, even though it's part of New Haven in many ways, is a small town. And I think he knew the difference between a rural and an urban area. What do you think, Tom?
In the 1920s and 30s, most plays, not all, Eugene O'Neill being an exception, most plays that were set in small towns, remote places, were comedies where you made fun of the Hicks. That was a real guaranteed way of entertaining a New York audience, is let's show how backward or how silly they are, or a character from the Hicks, the Sticks, comes to New York, and that's the subject of 100 plays. This play doesn't do that. He gives dignity to people that have been treated usually as stereotypes in American theater. It's like I said, there are some exceptions. O'Neill saw it as a tragedy of the life in the rural, and the terrible things that could happen. But this one, he says that these are real people. They're experiencing the same things you are, even though you live in an apartment building and you take the subway, and you are so-called sophisticated. You go to the museums, you go to the theater. I love when somebody asks about culture, in Grover's Corners, and she says, well, he's a piano teacher, but he says pretty much no, there's no culture here. Nobody's desperate for it. They're fine, but but even then he doesn't make fun of them and say, oh, these are stupid Hicks that don't appreciate art and music. He said, no, it's not part of their life. So yeah, I think that was very unique for him to take a small town and say, "Oh, they're real people with real problems, and we just can't make fun of them." And they did most of the time. So many comedies about that same thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's a very deliberate effort to go against the grain.
Mm-hmm.
I think was very typical of Wilder. If
Mm-hmm.
you said you couldn't do it, Wilder tried to do it.
Yes.
And the play, which seems to be the most ordinary and commonplace and uh, you know, to some extent tame sort of play, is really tremendously radical.
Yes.
Yeah.
I agree. Mm-hmm.
So and of course, he brought tears to Edward Albee. So,
Mm-hmm.
a New York sophisticator and someone who was a playwright. I want to ask you about how this play could inspire or maybe have an effect through osmosis, through a watercolor spread, if you will, onto other work. I'm thinking of Frank Capra's "It's a Wonderful Life," Jimmy Stewart and Donna Reed on Main Street, and
Mm-hmm.
themes of
Mm-hmm.
good and evil and staying together and keeping a community together in crisis. And ironically, in New Hampshire, Peyton Place. Two works that followed not too far after this work of Our Town came out in 1938. Do you think that others are inspired by Our Town and in taking a little bit of Thornton Wilder's work and putting it in their own work?
Mm-hmm.
Well,
I
and
think,
it has
go
a
ahead.
novel that came out this year that is entirely inspired by Our Town, Tom Lake. It's about a young woman who plays Emily in a summer theater production of Our Town, and her life has changed forever as a result of it. And Ann Patchett, who of course is one of our most well-known and deservedly well-rewarded modern novelists, says she rereads Our Town every year, and this book was her homage to Our Town. And thematically, the book, while it deals in subject matter to some extent with Our Town, as I say, this girl played Emily, thematically, it also owes a lot to Our Town, namely the idea of living life to its fullest and everything.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think certain, and as Tom mentioned, it's hard to go into a theater today where there's a curtain. It's hard to go into theater today where you don't occasionally have a narrator who starts the play by talking to the audience.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's had a tremendous effect on modern drama. And I think the notion today, I mean, tech people in theater hate it when I say this, but I think the notion today that you don't need a lot of scenery and you don't need a lot of costumes because there is a verisimilitude that is less than superficial is very influential in modern theater. Don't you agree, Tom?
Yes, I was going to say that forget even the themes of Our Town is one thing, but the theatricality has inspired so many people. We don't need the scenery. We could go from place to place with a line. We can have somebody talk to an audience at one point and change everything. We don't have to stick to what the convention is. We could tell a story, any story. We can zip through time. I think all that goes back to Wilder. I think that playwrights have learned to just not be held in by what people expect to see in a play, and particularly plays that will use time back and forth, go from place to place, and not worry about the conventional act one, scene two, that sort of thing. I think he's been, extremely influential. I was thinking that, 10 years after Our Town, Tennessee Williams writes The Glass Menagerie. It starts with Tom talking to the audience. It's a memory play. It's him going back and remembering, and it had scenery, but the scenery was kind of the way Joe Melsinger designed it. It wasn't realistic. It was just kind of his foggy memory. I'm sure Tennessee Williams was affected by this play to write something like that.
Yeah. So
Yeah,
it
and
had
you think
legs
of a
and
play,
inspiration.
you think of a play like Driving Miss Daisy, which
Oh yeah,
we all know from the movie version, but
no, the play.
that car was represented by four chairs in the
Mhm,
middle of the stage with
mhm,
nothing else on the stage. And
mhm.
you can't tell me, as someone who saw the play, that the
Mhm.
play was any less convincing because it wasn't a real car and
Right.
because they weren't seated and driving around town like they were in the movie. You completely
Mhm,
lost all need for the realism of the
mhm.
situation. And that's Wilder right there.
Yeah. And although he didn't write musicals, a lot of musicals have taken this theatricality, and it says we don't have scene one in a musical. We just kind of go from place to place. The set is a bunch of platforms, and we just move in and out of the story, and because there's a lot of freedom in the way a musical could go. Uh, and I think that, yeah, a lot of musicals are our town set to music. Tom Jones and Harvey Schmidt did a couple of musicals that I would call trying to be our town. Then they even did a musical of our town, which never got very far. But yeah, I think that the theatricality is so potent that it's still there. It's still, sometimes they're not even aware that it might be Wilder, but they know the effect. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think we have about, I guess, 10 to 15 more minutes. We do want to say that we have a couple of questions from
Mhm.
our attendees here tonight for Tom and for Jackson. Pat, you have a question for us.
I did not have a question exactly. I wanted to expand anecdotally on something that I can't remember which of you said this about the indirect vote and gave it as an example that it belonged in the period 1901 to 1913 and pre the vote. And I wanted to let you know in the mid 80s, our secretary at UConn here in Connecticut was excited because she was finally working. She was in her 50s. She was working to put her daughter through school, and she could finally vote the way she wanted to, not the way her husband did because she was earning money. So I think that the idea of an indirect vote is at the same time timeless, and it pertains both to men and women because her husband was, I knew him as well. He was upset. I mean, he no longer controlled two votes.
Mhm.
Now his wife was working, which was an affront to him on another level, but
Uh-huh.
so I think
Yeah.
that it also has a timelessness to it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and of course, what that line in the play, when he says women vote indirect, that implies just the opposite of what you're saying, which is that a woman can influence her husband, maybe, which of course was not very likely in Grover's Corners. I mean, when Doc Gibbs wouldn't even think of spending $350 to take his wife to Paris rather than to the battlefields of Gettysburg, he certainly wasn't going to let her tell him who to vote for.
Amazing when you think of that
Perhaps,
time
but I
period.
think that it also has a timelessness to it,
Oh yeah, of
for in the
course.
play for, people in different time periods reading it and seeing what's in there. Because certainly in 1938, when it was first shown, there were people who were not voting their way, but being influenced by others. But I remember my family, the women, trying to influence the men's votes anyway, period. And they had the vote.
Yeah, I heard a girl yesterday interviewed in Iowa and asked who she was going to vote for. She said, "Well, my parents are voting for so and so, so I'm voting for that person." So it's
Yeah,
still
it's that, or my aunt who always said she was canceling my uncle's vote. No matter which way he voted, she was going to do the opposite.
Yeah.
So I
Well,
mean, there's different interpretations to it, which just lends to everything you guys have been saying, about Wilder and how it pertains to any period and anybody, just how you interpret it for yourself, which to me makes good art.
absolutely.
timeless. Do you have other questions? Any other questions out there? Pat, thank you. That was an excellent observation that you made. I just want to talk about your work. And Jackson, I'll start with you.
Ray, can I ask a question?
Oh, Elizabeth, sure, yes.
How was Thornton Wilder very surprised about the popularity about the play? Did he expect that, or do you know of any of his reactions to how it became so enduring?
Well, when it opened in Boston, it almost never got to New York. It was the first week, as I remember, Tom, you may remember this as well, that it didn't sell very well, and it was only because the producer was willing at the last minute to bring it to New York that it even got to New York.
Right. The reactions were not good. And this is a New England audience, but they did not like it. They thought it was depressing. They didn't like what it said, and it did very bad business. When it got to New York, it was a different point of view. It was his first full-length play to be produced. Well, I shouldn't say that. He had a couple off-Broadway kind of things, but it was his first Broadway show, and it was successful, and it won the Pulitzer Prize, and he was very proud of it. And throughout his life, he would see productions. He was in productions. He played the stage manager a couple of times, many times, I think. And he was happy to see that the play was growing and living on its own, that he was finished, but it had a life of its own, more so than the other two plays is full-length plays that are very popular, Skin of Our Teeth and The Matchmaker. They didn't have this kind of life. And he lived long enough. He knew it was being taught in schools. He knew colleges, community theaters, high schools were doing this play. And that must have given him a lot of satisfaction.
But on the other hand, I would say, Elizabeth, that people in the Wilder world today, while nobody undervalues our town, we wish he were known better for some of his other work. In other words, he is now pretty much known as the author of our town, period. Right. He wrote some wonderful novels. He wrote, as Tom mentioned, some very good shorter plays, as well as two other wonderful plays. And it's really a cross to bear in many ways that he is known today primarily only as the author of our town.
That happens, to authors. His body of work is amazing. Like, people don't even remember, he wrote one of the best screenplays I think ever written, Shadow of a Doubt, for Alfred Hitchcock, an original screenplay that he wrote for Hitchcock, and it's still one of the best. It's Hitchcock's favorite movie, and it's one of my favorites too. But that was just another part of him, that he can write a screenplay that it was so potent. Yeah, and the novels, they're as different from one another. It's amazing how different they are.
I mean, The Bridge of San Luis Rey, which won the Pulitzer Prize, as Elizabeth mentioned, for fiction, is a marvelous, marvelous novel, which when I was in high school was often taught in high school and often admired, and I think was the way I was first introduced to Thornton Wilder. It's not nearly as well known now as it was years ago. And as Tom says, each of his novels is very different. And he wrote wonderful essays about theater too. I mean, he was an incredibly versatile writer, and in some ways it's sad that our town, as wonderful as the play is, and I hope we've made clear tonight that we think it's a wonderful play, I wish he were more widely read for some of the other things he wrote.
Yeah.
Well, I'd like to expand on that with the two of you, if I could, and just talk about your work and how you're expanding on the work of Thornton Wilder in a wider way. As president of Thornton Wilder Society, Jackson, you also are the co-editor of the Selected Letters of Thornton Wilder, Conversations with Thornton Wilder. So talk about your work as it pertains to Thornton Wilder. And Tom, ask you the same question to follow up.
Well, I'm glad you asked that, Ray, because I'm also one of 4 editors of a well-kept secret, the Thornton Wilder Journal, which publishes twice a year and is always in need of people to write about Wilder, people to come up with new things by Wilder that we can publish. And again, we're trying to encourage younger scholars, particularly younger academics, to look at the novels and come up with ideas about them, ways of teaching them. We publish two issues a year. It's under the auspices of the Thornton Wilder Society, which is a small but energetic group of academics and just plain fans of Wilder who are members of the society. I selfishly also recommend people look at his letters. He was an indefatigable letter writer.
Mm-hmm.
I think we felt when we did a selected letters that he wrote close to 6,000 letters in his lifetime, and we published just a fraction of them, probably 10% of them. But he corresponded with everybody.
Mm-hmm.
He was an incredibly social person. He knew everybody. And he is the epitome of what letter writing was as a somewhat lost art now. And the interviews that are in the Conversations book, all of which are reprinted interviews, he was obviously a very interesting person to interview. So he's a very interesting and complicated person in his own right.
Yeah. And, Tom, I can't even think of the Thornton Wilder Encyclopedia. Is it this big? Is it this big?
No,
That's a lot of
not,
research and a lot of things to cover.
But it is an encyclopedia. So, it's not essays that are going to go on and on like in a journal, the Wilder Journal, where you can get a whole essay about one aspect and everything. I want to say that anybody who has a society of people interested and a journal after him is got to be known for more than one play. You can't do this with our town. It's the breadth of his thing. My background with Wilder is the opposite. I discovered him because I was a theater person. In high school, I discovered our town. And I just thought it was so bizarre. And I just couldn't believe this play. And so I got fascinated with him as the playwright and saw productions, directed productions, and his other plays too. The one acts, a lot of them were not known until I think it was Tappan Wilder and other people collected them and printed them. Then I discovered that, he wrote novels. I had heard of The Bridge of San Luis Rey, and so I read that first. And I was just drawn to read all the novels. It's not that many, 7 or 8, I think. So that just made me appreciate them all the more. And so when I just wanted to write about Wilder, but I thought, well, what can I say? And it hasn't been said. And I thought, well, most people who love the novels don't know about his short plays, and people who know his plays don't know about his novels and don't know about his letters. And so I thought maybe an encyclopedia would be a way to really clearly show the breadth of this guy's, talent. And that's the point of the encyclopedia, is I cover everything, every short play, every, award, every, this and things that never finished, unfinished plays and scripts, because there is so much there. It's not a biography, but you sure get a good understanding when you can see every part of this man, not just a famous play or a famous novel.
Yeah. Well, before we wrap up and send it back to Elizabeth, just a very quick question, quick answers too from both of you as we wrap things up. And thank you so much for everything you provided tonight. We've learned a lot. Appreciate your insight. So Tom, we'll start with you. If you were to tell our friends and neighbors here in Hamden, how would you like to see Thornton Wilder's work beyond our town, but as a famous resident of Hamden, an enduring legacy with the town of Hamden? What would you like to see?
What I would personally like to see
our town of Hamden,
Okay.
keep the legacy alive of Thornton Wilder and his work so that
Oh.
generations to come will know about Thornton Wilder.
Yeah. Well, I guess it's a long shot. I would love to see his house that he built with the money from the Bridge of St. Louis. He called it the house that the bridge built. I would love to see that as a museum or as a library. That would be my personal, thing of that's what he deserves. And it doesn't sound like there's anything quite like that except collections at Yale, and in the local library. But that house should be kind of a monument to him.
Yeah.
Or a writer's retreat.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Writers staying there and getting a fellowship or a grant to stay there and work on something, so they don't have to earn a living for 6 months. Something like that. He would love that.
Beautiful. Jackson, what do you think?
Well, I'd like to see the library actually sponsor more programs like this, dealing with things other than our town. To spread I mean, I'm really in the business of trying to get, as much as I admire our town, and I think we've made pretty clear why it's a wonderful play. Wilder was a great deal more than our town, and he was even a great deal more than Bridge of San Luis Rey. And I would love to see the library sponsor a series of programs where they would have people talking about the novels, the shorter plays, just to get people, because I think when people read him, they see what we see. It's getting people to read him in a world where there's a lot of competition, both literary, visual, and every other kind of medium. To just pick up a book is not that easy to get people to do, particularly when it's a writer that they're not familiar with. So anything the city could do, the library could do, and I second Tom's suggestion about the house. I am associated with another American playwright I'm very interested in, William Inge, and his house in Independence, Kansas is now used for playwrights to go to write. And I don't know how the people who live in Wilder's house in Hamden would feel about it.
Let's hope they're listening in.
It would be a wonderful thing if that could happen. So thank you.
Mimsy Coleman has a thought.
Yes.
I don't know if all of you know, Ray, you know this, but that the library, the Hamden Library, does keep Thornton Wilder's name and reputation alive. I don't know how successful they are beyond that in encouraging readers to read his work, but they have an annual Thornton Wilder writing competition, and invites high school students from New Haven County to submit either prose or poetry. And then there is an annual award night and an award ceremony. And I do think, we do have a theater, an auditorium called Thornton Wilder Auditorium, which is why the U.S. Post Office came and issued their Thornton Wilder stamp from our auditorium. So I think the town, especially the library, is doing a lot to keep his name alive, and to make sure that we remain aware that he is one of our heroes. So
You've been instrumental with the Arts Commission for many years, making sure all this gets done.
Yes. So it was the Arts Commission and the library that collaborated at first on the Thornton Wilder writing competition. But I also, I just want to thank the three of you. This was a wonderful, informative, and enlightening conversation.
Thank you.
So
We've enjoyed it all. And Jackson and Tom, thank you. I enjoyed talking to you off air and on air about this. So thank you, Mimsy. And Elizabeth, I guess I'll send it back to you.
Yes, thank you so much, Ray, and also Professor Bryer and Professor Hischak for doing the panel discussion this evening We really appreciate it, and it was great that we could do it together in cooperation with the Whitney Players and their 20th anniversary production of Our Town. We do also have the Thornton Wilder study in the library, and you are right, we certainly can do much more, and this would be a wonderful start, and read some of his other books and plays and other performances of his plays in Hamden. So thank you very much. We appreciate it, and we will send a recording link and upload the recording to the library's YouTube channel. Thank you all for joining this evening. The weather's been awful here, but virtual is wonderful in wintertime. Thank you very much. I'll end the recording. Thank you all. Good night.